Welcome to Front Seat to Climate Change. I'm your host, Mahin Azam Khan. Every monsoon, as floodwaters swallow towns and villages across Pakistan, a familiar debate resurfaces. If only we had more dams. The argument seems logical. Dams store water, generate electricity, and can help regulate floods. But is building more mega dams really the solution to Pakistan's water and flood crisis? This year, Karachi and other parts of Sindh and Punjab were inundated after days of relentless rain. While families waded through waist-deep water, the call for more dams grew louder. Yet Pakistan already has some of the world's largest. Why do we still flood and still face droughts? To help us untangle this, we're joined today by a researcher who's going to break down these terms with us. Muhammad Adil Mansoor will be with us to explain how the dam business works. Assalamu alaikum, Adil Saab. Thank you so much for joining us. So every time floods hit Pakistan, we find ourselves arguing over the fact whether we should have more dams or not. So in your perspective, do you think that building more dams could really be the solution to Pakistan's floods?
Uh, Assalamu alaikum, and thank you for inviting me. So, in answering your question, I think a preamble needs to be stated in that as citizens, as people who discuss serious policy, we need to disengage ourselves and distance ourselves from sweeping statements and focus on trade-offs as a concept. What trade-offs means is that every policy choice that a government can make, whether it's dams, no dams at all, has certain adverse consequences as well as benefits. When making the policy choice, what we need to focus on is whether those dams or no dams, the cost benefit analysis is indeed is net in favor of the general public. Are dams all bad? If that were true, then Pakistan's population would not be the fourth largest or fifth largest in the world. The only reason why we have been able to feed this population on domestically grown crops for the last 60 years is thanks to those dams which helped us save water and grow crops in off season. As has been discussed now ad nauseum, that Pakistan is an arid region and it does not receive rainfall all across the year, or it does not receive snow as other countries do, as other major grain producer countries do, like Russia, Ukraine. So Pakistan, historically, if you go back, if it were to grow winter season crops such as wheat, which is our staple food commodity, that could have only happened if we had water availability in the off season as well, or in the winter season as well. Water availability only happens in Pakistan during the monsoon season when the glacial melt occurs, as well as precipitation also increases. And in the off season, that water would disappear were it not for those couple of mega dams. Now, going forward, do we need more dams as our population increases? That is debatable, but it is not debatable simply because all dams are bad or all dams are at risk of being destroyed if extreme weather events increase. The dams that we have built already, they made sense in the context of the time and the place we were in 1960s and 70s as a food deficit poor economy. Now, with the advent of extreme events, extreme weather events, and those happening at a heightened frequency at a distance of 2, 3 years rather than at a natural cycle or at the historical cycle of 7, 8, 7 years, 10 years at a time, we now need to rethink that model. What that model could be is actually, in my opinion, yet to be answered.
Thank you so much for giving this detailed explanation. So, do you think that this is the best? Is this the best investment compared to smaller, decentralized water projects such as recharge ponds and water harvesting and other smart water management systems?
Maybe yes and maybe no. If we had infinite resources, building more dams would not even be a question worth discussing uh, in public policy chat rooms, right? However, because we have finite rooms, does the finite resources, we do not even have access to foreign funding for the existing projects that are underway, such as the Ami Bhasha and Moman Dam. Only then does the question of what is the best use of our limited resources come up. Yes, smaller dams could also potentially increase our agricultural output. Yes, it could also increase our storage, but would smaller dam allow us to double our grain output in the off season over the next 30 years if our population increase does not flatten out. By 2050 or 2075, if our population doubles, our food requirements would also grow, especially if we do not increase our income levels such that we are able to afford import of food that is not that we are either not able to grow here or is not grown here in sufficient quantities, right? Countries which have high levels of income, such as Gulf, do not even have to worry about where their food is going to come from, right? They can. Saudi Arabia also has one of the highest levels of population growth in the world. It imports most of its grain requirements, whether it's grain, whether it's rice, whether it's meat. It does not have to bat an eyelid when it comes to the topic of building dams or not, being able to produce all of its agricultural output of it. The root causes are two. Number one, population growth rate. Number two, our level of income as a country and economy. You address both or even one of these two. The question of what you need to do to afford your growing food requirements of a 250 plus million nation would recede.
Even this year, we saw that after the floods, Pakistan faced intense food security. Adding on to what you said, I have another question related to that. That this year we also saw that there was a lot of urban flooding in Karachi, Lahore, and other parts of Pakistan. Do you think that large dams could have prevented the kind of flooding that we faced in these urban cities as well?
No, of course not, because large dams would have been built at places where floodplains within the river system are placed. So large dams are never in a position to stop flooding or extreme rainfall, urban flash flooding due to extreme precipitation in urban areas. Large dams basically serve two functions. One is hydroelectric power, which is one of the cheapest energy sources in the long run available, and it's also renewable. And second is obviously water storage, not for urban users, primarily for agricultural users. So large dams, especially where they are located, whether it would have been Kalabagh Dam, Hereford Trail, whether it's the Bela, which is built in near Mia Valley and at Indus, large dam like the Amir Bhasha, which would have been built in Gilgit Baltistan, for it to be built already. Is it whether it's Mangla, which is at the border of Kashmir and Punjab. All of these dams have nothing to do with the geographical location of our large cities. Our large cities have primarily been flooded due to extreme rainfall, which has been received in a very short window of time. Again, extreme weather events occurring at a pace and with severity not seen before in the last 30, 40, 50 years. So obviously, uh, the urban infrastructure, the roads, the networks, the housing colonies, they have all been built in design, keeping in mind the design and the demands of the last 30, 40, 50 years. But that pattern is changing and we need to adapt.
I think adding on to what you said, that especially the illegal housing societies played a lot of role in these urban cities, especially in Lahore and in Karachi as well. How do dams help or fail to help in controlling flash floods versus riverine floods?
Look, dams cannot save you from flash floods because flash floods occur in areas and places and locations where there is extreme rain. Now, that extreme rain could occur downstream of a dam, it could occur upstream of a dam. Obviously, if it occurs upstream of a dam, the dam would be able to store that extra water up to a certain degree, beyond which the spillways of the dam would have to be opened to release water so that the dam structure is preserved. Again, the purpose of a dam is not to control flooding. It is A, to generate hydroelectric power, and B, to store water for the off season and to provide water for the extraordinarily vast canal irrigation system that we have spread across all of Sindh, Punjab, and to some parts of Balochistan and KP. That is the purpose of large dams. Smaller dams, to a certain degree, can also allow you to store water, but their purpose is never to stop floods. floods cannot be stopped. Whenever a flood occurs or a flooding event occurs, the natural pathway or the natural choice that anyone has is to let that water flow downstream. The solution that you're looking for is not dam, whether it is for just for riverine floods or flash floods. The solution is to not have any population structures, whether urban or rural, any farms, fields, livestock areas in the areas which are historically declared based on geography, based on other parameters, floodplains. So any area which is floodplains, even if those rivers or those plains are seasonal. Water has not been received for the last 6, 8 years, 20 years, 30 years at a time. As long as rivers flowed from that area or that floodplain historically, we need to vacate. The solution that you're looking for is possibly in that direction, that we vacate the areas in the direction of where the floodplain is located, where the Kacha area is located, because once we are able to do that, only then, if an extreme flood event occurs, would we be able to avoid damage, whether it is damage to agriculture, whether it is damage to urban infrastructure. Now, is it feasible? If I may take 2 more minutes of your time, it is not feasible at all in the short run because so much of our economy, so much of our urban housing societies, so much of our road networks, so much of our utilities networks, so much of our agriculture, farming is done in those floodplains historically. But there are ways to go about it. The ways have been suggesting is that we already know that flooding occurs due to glacial melt during summer season. Historically, that those months have been restricted to July and August. Now, maybe that period is extending, let's say, because of flooding upstream in Indian parts of Indus Basin as well. So what can you do? What you can do is you can make sure that any agriculture that was historically done in the floodplains area is no longer done in the months of May, June, July, August, maybe sending it to September. So any flooding that occurs can occur during these monsoon months. Once the water from glacial melt recedes by October, November, we can have off-season agriculture in those areas. However, that solution is primarily restricted to the agriculture, due to the impact of flooding on agriculture. For urban infrastructures, if they are in the way of in the natural ways of water, those will have to be removed.
I think you mentioned some brilliant solutions, and I think these solutions will only be successful if there is a comprehensive planning from the side of the government. Because this year it is evidently very clear to us that this is going to happen again and again because of climate change, and we need to come up with a comprehensive plan. Because water management is something that we need to be very aware of, and we need proper planning for extensive water management rather than just relying on dams. Some also argue that dam can actually worsen downstream flooding if they're not managed properly. Is that true in Pakistan's context?
Of course, it's true. It's true in the context of any country where anything is not managed properly. The adverse consequences of mismanaging the exit and storage of water within dams could have devastating consequences. But the solution is better management and governance, not building dams at all. Look, we have to get out of the binary of dams or no dams. Or either we only want dams and that we want dams everywhere, or we want no dams at all. Dams serve a purpose, and they serve a purpose, an extreme purpose in our context, which they probably would not serve in maybe in the context of European countries and Netherlands and other parts of the world. Why? Because we also have a very, very large population. Now it's a circular argument. Had these mega dams not been built in the 60s and 70s, Pakistan would have probably faced famines and droughts of the levels that maybe our population would have never reached to 250 million mark, and our population growth rate would not have been one of the highest in the world. Yet, it is the very existence of these dams after they were built in 1960s and 70s that allowed us to become somewhat self-sufficient in foods. yes, our economy and our people are and our society is still largely relying upon very low nutrient carbohydrates as primarily as the primary source of nutrition of nutrition for the population. Having said that, again, had these dams not been built, we would have faced mass starvation. So now we have gotten to a point where dams have served a purpose. The solution going forward, if we do not control our population growth rate, if we do not control our requirement for food, which is growing at an exponential rate, we are also not increasing our purchasing power. We are also not growing our household incomes, which is why people are more and more, even more dependent on the same old agricultural output like wheat, like rice, like low value vegetables. If only were we to graduate in income levels of society, two things would happen. A, our nutrition requirement would shift away from these low value crops like grains, like wheats and rice, etc. And the number of the population growth rate may also flatten or decline over time. Only when that happens would our food requirement would stop increasing at an exponential rate, the way it has been going for the last 20, 30 years. As you may well know, our population growth rate actually increased from 2.3% per annum to 2.5% something between the last census and the latest census. So we have to look at the root cause of the problem before blaming any man-made structure completely for the root of all our ills. None of societal level problems are that plain and simple.
So, if we talk about other solutions instead of dams, what role do you think natural floodplains, wetlands, or green infrastructure can play in reducing floods?
They cannot reduce floods, they can only reduce the damage to human constructions that happens due to floods. If we get out of the way of natural rivers, we let the rivers flow as they are meant to, especially during, look, we have to understand, our rivers have never technically been perennial rivers. Yes, some water always flowed down Indus historically, but especially since the Indus Water Treaty, most of our rivers are dry, at least in some part, for nearly 6 months of the year, right? So, in those off months, what are you going to do? What you can do is, like I said, allow human constructions, temporary human constructions, allow agricultural activities, allow farming, allow crop grazing in floodplains only in the months when there is no chance of flooding. And in monsoon season, especially in high flooding regions or in areas which are either at high risk of flooding or receive higher level of water, especially in high monsoon months like August, September, July. You ensure that there is no agricultural activities taking place, there is no human activity taking place, there is no livestock grazing taking place, and these damages would not occur. Why do these damages happen in the first place? It's not because anyone to begin with allotted people land, or especially farmland in the riverbed. It's because we have our people are so poor, they're landless, and they do not have anywhere to go that they start cropping in riverbed when the riverbed is dry during the off season. They create permanent constructions. And since for the last 30, 40 years, the norm has been that we have not been seeing flooding, except for the extreme year of 2010. People felt safe, especially the poorest of people, felt safe building constructions in the riverbeds. These are illegal constructions, but they are so poor and do not have any alternates sources of income, any alternate uh, places to live, dwellings, that they are forced to be in the places that they are. Now that these flooding events are taking place at extreme frequency, obviously you will see that people over time will start moving out of the way of the river on its own. But can we wait for this natural process to occur at its own gradual pace? Of course not. We should hasten this process through policy intervention, encouraging people to move out of that floodplain, those river beds. Make sure that any new constructions or any rehabilitation does not allow people to return to those river beds or kacha areas of floodplain plains. And any farming that the government or the policymakers even want to allow during in those floodplains is only allowed during the off months. It takes better route management, it takes better governance, it does not take rocket science or a lot of money.
Like you mentioned, that governance has a huge role to play in this factor, and so does implementation. If we don't implement the right policies, illegal housing societies will continue to be built, and people will continue making their houses along the rivers as well. Pakistan also faces a lot of problems, like you mentioned as well: lower incomes, higher population, and also beyond floods, we face water scarcity as well. So, how much do you think new dams or these other water management systems can actually solve that problem of Pakistan?
Smaller dams checked across the length and breadth of the country can help us store water. Rainwater harvest systems can help us do that, building sponges and allowing the groundwater aquifers to be recharged through the natural flow of floods and natural flow of rivers and canals that can happen, and that will also help. But the idea is to rethink the way we live with water. The idea is to understand that yes, we may not receive rainfall the way places like Sri Lanka or places like in southern India or places like Far East does, but because we live in a river basin, in one of the biggest river basins in the world, we live downstream of three of the greatest glacial ranges of the globe, Himalaya, Karakoram, and Hindu Kush. We need to adapt our ways according to our geography. And the way to move forward is to ensure that we have proper drainages, proper systems. It is a conversation not around rehabilitation, but around adaptation. The first thing we need to do is to stop blaming the outside world, whether it is India or whether it is global warming, because neither global warming nor India forced us to build illegal housing, whether around rivers and floodplains. Neither India nor global warming forced us to conduct agriculture in floodplains and riverbed. So the outside world is not to blame. We were used to living a certain way because for the last 50 years, flooding and extreme weather events were not so common. That way of working has outlived its useful life. Now the weather patterns are changing. The only imperative that we face is to adapt according to it. So the conversation needs to stop. Honestly, it needs to stop. It needs to shift from the word climate justice. It needs to shift away from finding the outside world fund our rehabilitation. It needs to shift away from finding climate finance and global funding or global loans and grants to rehabilitate us. It also needs to shift away from blaming our eastern neighbor for sending more water downstream, because where else can the water go? It needs to focus, and with a razor sharp focus on how can we build again and build better this time.
I think indeed it has to shift from climate justice, like you said, to adaptation and rehabilitation, because this is something that we will face every year. And the blame game indeed needs to stop, because India is also facing the same amount of floods that we are, and with the same severity. Since we are discussing the management of dams, could you also please tell us what are the environmental risks of large dams, such as loss of biodiversity, seismic risk, or altering the river ecosystems? And how do these dam projects, they often affect local communities in terms of displacement and livelihoods?
Again, I would like to say that we need to focus on the word trade-off. Of course, there are trade-offs. Of course, when you store water, look, every resource is finite, every natural resource is finite. The Indus Basin or the Indus River system always had a finite quantity of water, let's say 100 units. When you started storing it upstream around Tarbela, Mangla, India started storing the water in its own regions. China also started storing water in its own regions. Of course, the water that would flow downstream would reduce. Of course, biodiversity was then going to be affected adversely. Of course, the ecological flows or the environmental flows to the delta were to reduce. This is not some discovery that anyone has landed upon today. It is all very basic common sense and logic. That if you store something upstream, the whatever residue or whatever remainder that flows downstream would be less than it used to be before the storage was built. The question to answer is, did the positive benefits or did the positive spillovers from building dams and similar constructions were greater at the time of its construction than the negative uh, consequences. And to my mind, back in 60s, back in 1970s, when Pakistan was a food deficit country, it was dependent on wheat aid and PL 420 from America and Russia. When there were mm, uh, when developing countries or low income countries like Pakistan faced challenges like mass starvation, when India also faced mass hunger, building dam and ensuring that we had enough food requirement or enough food for our society was the right. Yes, those adverse consequences were understood at that time also. They're only better understood now because those adverse consequences have played out for the last 30, 40 years. Water does not flow downstream, poultry, barrage, biodiversity in terms of aquaculture around rivers and fresh waters has lowered. Groundwater recharge has been adversely affected. Environmental flows to the delta have reduced, which in turn has resulted in uh, seawater intrusion and land disappearance in the coastal districts of Badi, Sudawat, Thetta. Still, I would argue that you have to weigh the cost and benefits. But more importantly, you need to get out of that conversation of what happened in the past because whether it was for good or bad, it is done and dusted. The important question to ask is, and I'm phrasing it again, if our population continues to grow at the pace it grows currently and has been for the last 20, 30, 40 years, can we afford to live without building new dams? Because we would need more storage, not less, to produce more food for the greater number of people. The answer is focusing on population control, focusing on raising household incomes, income graduation, make people richer. They would have fewer uh, number of children. That is the universal lesson that has been learned from development economics around the world. Make sure that occurs, ensure that the people can afford better nutrition, whether it is locally grown or imported. And then the question of whether we need to build dams would disappear on its
own. What role do you think that government, private sector, and civil society can play in adopting better water management systems and can play their part to a solution for all the problems that you also just listed?
I don't think civil society has a very large role to play. Yes, it can create awareness. Yes, it can also have similar conversations as we are having now at a greater frequency. But it also needs to step out of silos where, again, people either become completely Luddites and focus on pre-industrialization solutions. And they also need to talk to each other. So people who are very pro-dams need to talk to people who are very anti-dams. People who are against the indigenous canal system around the Indus Basin. You talk to people who are against it, and so on and so forth. Number one. Number two, the actual action that needs to be taken at societal level is again in agriculture because that's where the majority of our freshwater resource that flows downstream, the glaciers and the river system is consumed. What do we need to do over there? We need to make sure that water efficient practices in agriculture are affordable, A, accessible, B, C, they also make in economic sense.
What we've heard today is that dams are not a silver bullet. They can store water and generate power, but they also come with costs: financial, environmental, and human. Pakistan's challenge is not about building more, but about managing smarter. As climate change brings heavier rains and harsher droughts, the path forward may not lie in more concrete alone, but in restoring wetlands, reviving floodplains, and investing in local water solutions. That's all for this episode of Front Seat to Climate Change. I'm your host, Mahin Azam Khan. See you next week.